class, it's Miss Jump again for another video, and today we're going to talk about the United States entering World War II and a specific attack that occurred on the harbors of Pearl Harbor and Hawaii. And if you're looking at this map here, the location of the attack happens right here. And it's about the halfway point between America and Japan. But before we talk about the attack of Pearl Harbor, we need to talk about some events that lead to the attack. So after the war broke out in Europe, isolationism had lost some of its appeal for Americans. Most now openly supported the Allies. And hoping to keep the United States out of war, Hitler sought to expand his alliance. By the way, this is Hitler right here. In September of 1940, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the Tripartite Pact, making Japan a member of the Axis powers. The three nations agreed to provide mutual support in the event of an attack by a country not yet at war. So again, this happens in 1940. It's called the Tripartite Pact. And this is going to be the countries, or these countries that signed the Tripartite Pact are going to be what we now know of as the Axis powers. Germany, Italy, and Japan had all agreed that if any of the countries are attacked by a country that is not already at war, that they will lend a helping hand. And the attacker they had in mind was the United States. If the United States had entered the war, it would have to fight on two fronts. It would have to fight a war in Europe, in the Atlantic, and it would have to fight a war in Japan, in the Pacific. Or you can think of it as they would have to fight a war in Europe and would have to fight a war in Asia. Hitler had hoped that the threat of the two-front war would ensure American neutrality for a while longer. So what I've done in this video, I wanted to kind of give you a little bit of a background. We have the Axis powers. All three of the Axis powers are now members of the Axis powers. And what I've decided to do for this video is kind of split it up. I know that it's a little bit confusing. This World War II is one of the most, if not the most confusing war in American history. And it happens all at once in different locations, and they all influence each other. So what I've decided to do in this video, and this video is going to be focusing on the changes to American relationships abroad, or the changes to American support of the war. And the first half is going to talk about changes to how America deals with the war in Europe, and the Allied and Axis powers in Europe. And the second half, we will talk about the changes to the relationship between the United States and Japan. So really, for this entire video, it's going to be looking at, in depth, the changes that America has on international relationships. So, let's start in Europe. We talked about the Neutrality Act that was signed in 1935, and it was signed by President Roosevelt. And in 1935, he said that the U.S. will not supply arms, ammunition, or implements of war to nations of conflict. Now, there were some additional neutrality acts that were signed in 36 and 37 that basically said the same thing. Like, we're not trading with anybody who's at war with another country. And this was there to prevent, hopefully, at least Roosevelt thought, this is going to prevent the Axis powers, or what we now know of Axis powers, to continually expand their empire in Europe and affect our relationship with the allies that we have. Of course, this was before the war even started. The only expansion that was happening in Asia. And that's not really what our focus was at the moment. It was really in Europe. So in 1935, this made sense. But by 1939, expansion was happening. In 1939, you have the expansion of Germany into Czechoslovakia and Austria. So Roosevelt had to change this Neutrality Act. It was at the point where a lot of Europe was at war, or was about to be in war. And so he knew that this no trade with nations at war was not going to play well in the United States, especially when we were so reliant on trade with England and Europe. So what we decided in 1939 to have another Neutrality Act. And this Neutrality Act still made the United States neutral in the war. However, it had a provision called cash and carry. And basically what it said was if you wanted to trade with the United States, you would have to take your boats across the Atlantic or any ocean, trade with the United States on the ports of the United States with cash, and then take your boats back. So we are not, if you're looking at this in like a very broad image, if you were analyzing like the boats that are in and out, it looks like America is still remaining neutral. There are no American boats that are trading technically with Europe. But that doesn't mean that England isn't sending their own ships to the Atlantic and trading with the United States and then sending their own ships back. So this was a really nifty kind of tactic to make America seem like they're still neutral while still supplying goods to countries in Europe that America is so reliant on. If we were to continue to say that there was no trade allowed at all to any nations at war, we are losing a lot of our trading partners. In this way, we can still keep those partners while remaining neutral. In 1940, after the fall of France, so we talked about the fall of France or the Nazis' invasion of France in 1940, Roosevelt immediately began to expand the United States military. First time, and I believe it's even the only time in American history, peacetime draft was enacted. So what I mean by peacetime draft is that people were drafted into the military or chosen at random into the military. During a time in which the American country was actually not at war with anybody. We were not at war at all, but yet there was a draft that had drafted millions of men to go into war. At the same time, however, in 1940, Roosevelt was running for president, and he was listening to some of the whispers of the people in America that said, oh goodness, we're having this draft. There's this draft happening, which means we're about to go to war. And the argument that Roosevelt made was, this draft was not used to fight in Europe. In fact, it was used to defend the United States. We are in a very weird position. We're kind of just laid out here. There's no one on the sides of us to kind of watch out our backs. Like we are very open as a country. And drafting a military would provide the defense that we need to protect ourselves from any invasion that happens abroad. And he had promised in 1940, when he was reelected into office, that he was going to keep the United States out of war, that this draft was not an automatic support of the war abroad. Because even though we were losing some isolationist ideas, most people in the United States, they wanted to see the end of the war, but they still wanted the United States to remain neutral in the war. So also in 1940, you see a relationship beginning to build. And we talked about in the last video, the Battle of Britain. And that happens in 1940. If you think about the video that I showed of the Narnia movie, where you see like the kinds of events that are happening in England at the time, where they were being raided by the German Air Force for every single day, for months on end. And the current Prime Minister, and I hope you know his name, Winston Churchill, is in a really rough spot right now. The country is being continuously attacked by Germany. They are using every single resource they can to defend themselves and to attack Germany back. Like they're sending bombs over to attack Berlin. They're trying to attack the Air Force while they're in the air to prevent them from reaching England. They're using every single piece of energy, every dollar, or I guess pound in England that they have to fight against the Germans. And Winston Churchill called up Roosevelt. Now I'll go ahead and label Roosevelt too. And said exactly what I just said. Like, we have been fighting the Germans and we are not doing a great job. And in fact, we're about to be bankrupt. We don't have money to continue to fight this. And I know you said that we can go and trade with you from the Neutrality Acts, but we don't have the money to pay you for those goods. So Roosevelt, wanting to support his allies, pushed Congress to enact what is now going to be known as the Lend-Lease Act. So this happens in 1941. Well, it happens in 1940, but it passes in 1941. The Lend-Lease Act basically says, you want to come just like before, where you send your ships to America, we'll give you your goods, and you can send your ships back. The only difference now is you don't have to pay right now for those goods. We will let you borrow them, and then after the war, you can pay us back. And this, again, keeps America neutral in the war, but it also helps the allies that need those additional resources. Because if they don't have it, then England falls. They already lost France. France isn't in the picture anymore. So we have to make sure to support our allies, because eventually this war might reach us, and we need to be ready with as many reinforcements as possible. We're going to move on here to talking about the relationship between the Soviet Union, who is run by Stalin, and Germany, which is run by Hitler. Now, we talked about the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Act. Early on in the late 1930s, the Soviet Union had aligned with Hitler. When Hitler went and told Stalin that he was going to invade Poland, he said, look, let me invade Poland, help me to invade Poland, I'll give you some spheres of influence in Europe. In exchange, you don't attack us, and we won't attack you. From the very beginning, Hitler knew that this is going to be a very short-lived alliance, because he had plans even back then to attack the Soviet Union. But he wanted to make sure that the other issues, France and England, was kind of out of his way. Like, he didn't have to worry about those, so that way he didn't have to fight a war on two fronts. And at this moment, in 1940, 1941, he is destroying England. England is falling apart at the seams. He's already taken over France. So he decides in 1941 to break the Non-Aggression Act. With the Soviet Union. Now, this is important for a couple of reasons. First off, this immediately makes Soviet Union hateful of Hitler. Originally, they were allies, but now that's not the case anymore. Hitler invading the Soviet Union had made the Soviet Union pretty pissed off at the Axis powers. And at the same time, you have England, who's currently being attacked, being bombed by Germany. They're sending their support to the Soviet Union. And the United States, who's not on this map, is over here. They actually begin to allow trade with the Lend-Lease program that I've just discussed, where the Soviet Union can borrow goods from America and pay them back after the war. So all of a sudden, once this attack occurs, Germany has just built the Allied powers, even more so than before. So just to kind of keep everyone on the same page here, this attack on the Soviet Union created the Allied powers, which include, of course, England. Now, I'm going to put France down there. And obviously, France has been taken over pretty early on in the war by Germany. But they were still pretty integral in fighting off the Germans when they did. So I'm going to stick them in the Allied powers, but I'm going to cross them out just to signify like they're dead. They're not in this right now. And of course, you have the United States. And now you have the Soviet Union, USSR. And to kind of compare to what the Axis powers has at this time period, you have the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan. So we're pretty even, or 3 countries that are in each side of this war. And what is also kind of important, we begin to actually send our ships to help the Soviet Union and to help England using our own ships. So no longer are we telling them that they have to supply their own transportation. We are transporting those goods to them ourselves. So you see the continual increase of Americans' involvement in the war in Europe. So just real fast before we move on, before I start talking about the war in the Pacific and the war between the Allied powers and Japan, I want to kind of talk about the changes in trade that occurs in America when we talk about our relationship with those in Europe. So it first starts in 1935 when we sign the Neutrality Act of 1935 that basically says no trade with anybody at war. And that just is made to prevent some of the Axis powers from continuing to talk about invasion or to actually invade. And by 1939, they actually begin to invade. It's no longer talking about invading, it is invasion. So in 1939, you have the Neutrality Act of 1939 that says, bring your ships and pay in cash. You can come on over here, we'll trade with you, even if you're at war, we'll trade with you, but you're going to have to pay in cash and you're going to have to come here. So that way it still looks like we're neutral. And finally, we get into the Lend-Lease Act that says, well, first it was passed in 1941, and it says, bring your ships and you can borrow. And by 1941, the end of 1941, after the Soviet Union has been invaded by Hitler, we begin to actually sail our own ships to trade with others across in Europe. So we start from no trading to, hey, be secretive, bring your ships, pay in cash, to, okay, well, we're going to support the Allied powers, you bring your ships, and you can borrow the goods that you can pay back later. To, we are going to bring the goods to you. So you see this like really pretty sudden change. I mean, within, this is 1941, within, 8 years, this change of no trading to we are going to help you wherever we can. But still, by 1941, we have not joined the war officially. So now we're going to move over to Asia, or the Pacific. So we talked about before Japan's occupation of Asia, and it starts with Manchuria in 1932. They first go to Manchuria in 1931, but they don't officially take it over until 1932. And when they conquered Manchuria, if you remember, they were actually told by the League of Nations that they need to leave, that Manchuria is not up for debate, that Japan needs to stop invading. And instead of listening to them at this point in 1932, Japan leaves the League of Nations. But their expansion does not stop. This happens in 1937, the invasion of Inner Mongolia by the Japanese. And then by 1938, you have this green area. And by 1940, you have some of this area here, and then Tenkong. Now, Japan had continued to seek raw materials through conquest. It occupied French Indochina and Southwest Asia and set its sights to the Dutch East Indies, which is right down here. So it had conquered this in 1942, and it had set its sights down here to the Dutch East Indies. And its goal was to push Western powers out and establish a new order in Asia with Japan at its center. So it wanted to conquer all of Asia. Now, before I move on, I want to kind of show patterns that you see here. They start up north in Manchuria, and then they slowly spread their imperialist ideas down south, further and further. Every year it's a little bit more south than the last. And this becomes important in a minute. But the United States had attempted to undercut Japanese imperialism in a couple of ways. First, it allowed loans to be given to the enemies of Japan. And in this point, if you look, most of the land that's being taken over is being taken over in China. And this was in the Lend-Lease Act. They were saying, hey, China, if you need anything, let me know, we got you. So China was trying to get the goods and resources that they would one day pay America, but at the time, these resources helped kind of strengthen the Chinese military. Secondly, America had froze all Japanese assets in America. So anything that could help to increase the money used to imperialize. Grand generals might be owning different buildings in America. They cannot sell those assets, that money that they might have stuck in a American bank, for example, because freezing, America would not allow that to happen. They froze Japanese assets in America. Third was that America had blocked the trade of vital resources with Japan. And as I mentioned before, at this point, America is one of the biggest exporters of oil in the world. And without oil, Japan cannot conquer all of these areas or continue to conquer these areas. And so when America has decided to block the resources, Japan has to invade. They have to continue to invade because that's the only way that they will get the resources they need to strengthen their empire. And due to these, the relationships between America and Japan had slowly began to worsen. Now we're finally going to get to Pearl Harbor. So in 1941, American intelligence officers had intercepted a message from the Japanese embassy that said that Japan was planning to attack an American territory in the Pacific. And if you think about the pattern that we were just talking about in Japan and the imperialism that started up here and then slowly made its way down every year, American officials, including the president, understood that this attack was going to happen somewhere on American territory within the Pacific. And the logical area, the logical spot that they think the attack was going to happen was right here in the Philippines. And so to kind of prevent as much carnage as possible, the American military had removed most of the military vehicles, the boats, the submarines, and really most of the military goods and individuals that were in the Philippines were moved to the Hawaiian Islands. And this becomes a little important because it turns out that the Philippines was not the target. And in fact, America kind of almost shot itself in the foot a little bit because it just so happened to send all of the people, the goods and the things over here in the Philippines to the areas in which the attack will happen. And to make matters even worse, Pearl Harbor, this is where it's located, on the largest island in Hawaii known as Oahu, and Pearl Harbor is the home of the entire naval fleet in the Pacific. Of America. This is where they have been storing all of the naval boats, all of the planes, all of the resources that they think they will one day need in the event of a war. And they have it here on Hawaii. In case that war is declared, it is a perfect location. As I mentioned before, this is about halfway between the United States and Japan. So if war gets declared, this is a good spot to have to send their reinforcements to anywhere that they're needed in the Pacific. And to make matters even worse, the Pearl Harbor attack happened on the day in which most, if not all, of the vehicles that were supposed to be on the island were there. There was actually a competition between the Navy, the fleets in the Navy, and they all had parked around the border of the Pearl Harbor. Before I get into the actual attack of Pearl Harbor, I want to first talk about what the planes that are used in this attack. And if you've ever seen any kind of World War II movies, specifically things like Pearl Harbor, the movie, which is a phenomenal movie, and I highly recommend you watch it, but if you ever see any movie about World War II, you would sometimes hear people refer to Zeros. I believe even in the movie Pearl Harbor, there's a scene in which there's a bunch of like naval buddies that are talking, and one of the naval buddies says like, my brother died from a Zero. And they don't necessarily clarify what a Zero is, but a Zero is a nickname for the planes that are used for kamikaze attacks. And kamikaze attacks are when a pilot of a plane is told to run their plane into and destroy a specific target. And kamikazes, in some ways, is strategic suicide. If you were picked to be a kamikaze, and there are many people that were, but there are many people who also volunteered to become kamikazes, we didn't really talk about this idea of honor in the Japanese culture. And that's still sort of a thing that you see. And it's not just in Japan, but in Asia in general. If you think of Mulan, where in Mulan you talk about like honor being such a big deal. And that was the same in Japan. It was a very honorable profession. It was very honorable for you to become a kamikaze pilot. And they thought that you would live in paradise with the emperors of Japan. But these kamikaze fighters would be sent to training, and the training would last from 6 to 8 weeks. The average amount of time between training and their death is about 2 months. So it was almost a guarantee that you will die. And basically what happens is every plane will be given a target. And their target was the only thing that they needed to worry about, was hitting that target. And obviously this picture is a newer picture. There are some Zeros, there are some planes from Japan that have survived the war, and a lot of collectors are interested in buying and selling them. And in fact, if you ever have the chance to go to Dayton in the Air Force Museum, they do have a kamikaze or Zero from the Japanese Air Force in World War II that I highly recommend you seeing. It puts things really into perspective about some of the sacrifices that people made. So these kamikazes and these Zeros were used highly in World War II, and specifically Pearl Harbor. So Pearl Harbor happened on December 7th of 1941. And this is also known as the day that lives in infamy. You'll hear that a lot. And every year on December 7th is. So the Japanese aircraft carriers approached Hawaii, and from the carriers, more than 300 bombers and fighter planes launched an attack on Pearl Harbor. In a little more than 2 hours, the Japanese sank or damaged 18 American ships, and at nearby airfields, Japan warplanes damaged or destroyed about 300 military aircraft. In all, the raid left more than 2,400 Americans dead and another 1,200 wounded. And the total damage that occurred on the side of the Japanese was 29 planes. This entire attack only made 29 planes destroyed in Japan. And most of those plane attacks, those destruction of planes, actually occur because of the kamikaze pilots running into the different boats on the docks. So this guy right here, this is a picture of the most well-known and really the most dangerous place to be during the Pearl Harbor. And this is the USS Arizona. So what happened was the USS Arizona had some bombs that were inside their storage facility in the middle of the boat. And the kamikaze pilot that landed and destroyed the USS Arizona had actually done something, and I don't remember precisely what they did. The kamikaze attack actually led to the explosion of that bomb. And that explosion led to the explosion of the oil tank inside the USS Arizona. And oil was floating on top of the ocean. So if you think about the water here, oil had come out of the oil tank within the USS Arizona and had floated on top. And this should be common knowledge when it comes to science, but oil doesn't mix. Like when you throw oil on water, it just floats on the top. And to make matters even worse, when the oil was spilled into the surrounding sea, it was also on fire. And I can't draw flames, but because you have all of the fire that was happening from around the area and things falling into the water that's on fire, that actually caught the oil on fire. So those who were on the USS Arizona had two choices. They either had to die from the flames that were happening, the attacks from the actual flames, the boat being on fire, or they can jump and also hope that the fire doesn't kill them that's on the bottom. And the USS Arizona had a total of 1,517 total men on board. And at the end of the day, on December 7th of 1941, 1,177 had died. So less than 400 of the 1,500 men that were on the USS Arizona actually lived. And over here is another image. This is an image from outside of a hospital that was noticing the attack going on, and they had taken some photographs of the attack. And this is the experience that you would have seen as a civilian or even as a military member, maybe not on the boats, but just kind of going around the area of Pearl Harbor. Now, this is one of my favorite images in American history, mostly because it's just incredible what transpired here. So as you can see, they are on a boat, and in the background, a kamikaze plane that is about ready to hit. And this, by the way, is USS Missouri. So just like the USS Arizona, Missouri had some bombs in its arsenal, inside stored within the boat. And once the plane was seen, they were able to actually use the defense cannons that they have. And I'm not sure if this is technically defense cannons, but they have these defense cannons that were able to steer the kamikaze pilot to hit the side right about here. And if they were to actually collapse or go further into the boat, the same thing that happened at the USS Arizona could happen in the USS Missouri. But they were able to prevent that from happening. And what's super incredible to me is that 0 people actually died on the USS Missouri. Looking at this image, I can't imagine the type of fear that some of these men had to kind of face, where there was no expectation that anything would happen. They weren't even at war. And this attack just completely devastated. You can still visit Pearl Harbor to this day. In fact, every ship and every person that has died has remained at the location of their death. So the USS Arizona actually has a platform that you can stand on that's see-through, and you can look down in the bottom of the ocean. You can visit it. You can see kind of the total carnage that had enacted. Now, once this occurred, once the Japanese military attacked Pearl Harbor, obviously the United States immediately joined the war. The idea of remaining isolationist was dumb, because now we were physically attacked. And so we joined the Allied powers, and we will continue on talking about what that means later this week. And this week, I want to start kind of moving our focus in from talking about the war abroad to talking about the home front, or talking about what is happening in the United States in this time period. Today is going to be the last day that we're going to talk about the war, and then for the rest of the week, we're going to talk about what's happening in the United States that leads to people to support the war, and some changes that are happening in American society. For today, I am going to have you guys complete a web quest that asks you to look more into the attack on Pearl Harbor, and to answer some questions about some of the heroes that were involved. And I encourage you, if you're interested in this, to look into the Memorial of Pearl Harbor's website. It's under the U.S. Memorial Service site, and they have a lot of really, really amazing primary sources there. I am going to be posting the assignment, the web quest, today, and I'm not going to expect you to be done with it until tomorrow at midnight. Now, I know I've gotten some emails from students who are talking about struggling right now, and I want to repeat the fact that I am here for you, and if you need any help with the assignments, or you need someone to talk to, I am in quarantine as well. I know that a lot of you guys, just from the emails that I've sent, are struggling with some really personal issues with family members, and even, things that are happening in your life that are out of your control. And I want you to know that if you need some time, you need some extra time to work on some assignments and to catch up, I will allow that. However, I need to know whether or not you are choosing to not do the assignment because you just don't feel like it, or there's something more going on. Because I, as a teacher, am required to write down any of the students who are not contributing to the classroom discussions and the classroom assignments on Google Classrooms. And if I know that you are not turning it in because you're dealing with some personal issues, I won't write your name down. But if I just keep seeing that you're not returning things in, or you're not turning things in properly at the time that it's due, then I have to write your name down, and you will get a call from the principal or the administration. I hope that the quarantine has been treating you guys well. I know that I have been sent a message from the central office reminding me to remind you to stay inside, that this is a quarantine for a reason, and that means no going out and partying, no going to play basketball at the parks. Stay inside as much as you can. So with that reminder, and with that being said, I want to end this here. If you have any questions, once again, do not be afraid to email me, to message me on Remind. I actually just found out that I had turned off the notifications for comments on Google Classrooms, and I don't know when I did this, but I did. And so if you have commented on Google Classrooms in the last couple of weeks and you think that I've been ignoring you, know that I have not. I just didn't know that it was there. So I'm going to try to return some of those comments back today. That being said, I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. And once again, please do not hesitate to message me for any type of help.